So we're starting on page 186 tonight. It's chapter 8, entitled Love and God. There can be no greater folly than that the aspirant quarrel with another over the pros and cons of this way or that, instead of concentrating on his own onward march. One road may be steep, another full of potholes, a third torn by racing rivers. Similarly, one man may walk best, another may be a good runner, a third a fine swimmer. In each case, the things that should really count are the destination and the progress each individual makes. Why should one who runs like a hare come in the way of another who is more likely to succeed at the pace of a snail? Spiritual progress is like climbing through hills, dales, thorny woods, and along dangerous precipices to attain the mountaintop. On this path, there can be no halting or return. Everyone must get to the top, which is the direct realization of the Supreme Godhead. All hesitation, sidetracking, or resting in halfway houses, or arguing about the best route only postpones the day of final fulfillment. The aspirant cannot be too alert about the path. The slightest lingering in the false world of shadows is inevitably an invitation to suffering that could have been avoided if the eye had been steadily fixed on the supreme goal of life. The best of all forces, which can overcome all difficulties on the way, is the love that knows how to give without need to bargain for a return. There is nothing that love cannot achieve, and there is nothing that love cannot sacrifice. There is nothing beyond God, and there is nothing without God. And yet God can always be captured by love. All other essential qualities will come to the aspirant if he follows faithfully the whisperings of the unerring voice of love that speaks from his own heart, shedding light on the path. To lose hold of the mantle of this guide is to find only despair. The heart without love is entombed in unending darkness and suffering. But the heart that is restless with love is on its way to realization of the unfading light that shines on the unfathomable sweetness of life divine. Pure love is matchless in majesty. It has no parallel in power, and there is no darkness it cannot dispel. It is the undying flame that has set all life aglow. Yet it must be kindled and rekindled in the abysmal darkness of selfish thoughts, selfish words, and selfish deeds. As it is fired anew, it bursts out in magnificent light to serve as a beacon for those who still grope in the darkness of selfishness. Be that darkness deep blue or all black. Human love, regardless of its limitations, should never be despised. It is bound eventually to break through all limitations, to initiate the aspirant into eternal life in the truth. Then the lover may lose his separate false self and become united with God, who is the one matchless and indivisible ocean of unsurpassable love. God does not listen to the language of the tongue and its jops, mantras, devotional songs, and so on. He does not listen to the language of the mind and its routine meditations, concentrations, and thoughts about God. He listens only to the language of the heart and its message of love, which needs no ceremony or show, only silent devotion for the beloved. This love can be expressed in various ways, all of which ultimately result in union with God. The practical way for the average man to express love is to speak lovingly, think lovingly, and act lovingly towards all mankind, feeling God to be present in everyone. Love is dynamic in action and contagious in effect. It is only the spiritually alive and enlightened who can feel the significance of the ancient adage, so cheaply bandied about by some preachers and philosophers, that, quote, love begets love, end quote. The way of love is not free from sacrifices. Just as heat and light go hand in hand, so do love and sacrifice. The true spirit of sacrifice springs spontaneously, like humility, and cannot be aware of itself, nor reserve itself for particular objects and special occasions. Love means suffering and pain for oneself and happiness for others. To the giver, it is suffering without malice or hatred. To the receiver, it is a blessing without obligation. Just as it can never be too early or too late to learn to love for the sake of love, so there can be nothing too small or too big to be sacrificed or sacrificed for. The flow of life, the flow of light, and the flow of love are as much in the drop as in the ocean. The smallest thing is as big as the biggest, and the biggest thing is as small as the smallest. It all depends upon the particular yardstick used. The spirit of true love and real sacrifice is beyond all ledgers and needs no measure. A constant longing to love and be loving, and a non-calculating will to sacrifice in every walk of life, high and low, big and small, between home and office, streets and cities, countries and continents, are the best measures man can take to be really self-full and joyful. Love is different from lust. In lust, there is dependence upon the physical object, and thus spiritual subordination of the soul to it. Love puts the soul into direct, coordinate relation with the reality which lies behind the form. Therefore, lust is experienced as being heavy, but love is experienced as being light. In lust, there is a narrowing down of life, while in love, there is an expansion in being. To have loved one soul is like adding its life to your own. Your life is multiplied, and you live virtually in two centers. If you love the whole world, you live vicariously in the whole world. But in lust, there is an ebbing of life and generation of a sense of hopeless dependence upon a form which is regarded as another. Mona, would you like to read? You have to unmute first. Oh, I guess Mona's busy, so I'll continue. Thus, in lust, there is accentuation of separateness and suffering. But in love, there is a feeling of unity and joy. Lust is dissipation. Love is recreation. Lust is a craving of the senses. Love is the expression of spirit. Lust seeks fulfillment, but love experiences fulfillment. In lust, there is excitement. In love, there is tranquility. Divine love is qualitatively different from human love. Human love is for the many in the one, and divine love is for the one in the many. Human love leads to innumerable complications, but divine love leads to freedom. In divine love, the personal and impersonal aspects are equally balanced. But in human love, the two aspects are in alternating ascendancy. Human love, in its personal and impersonal aspects, is limited, but divine love, with its fusion of the personal and impersonal aspects, is infinite in being and expression. If instead of seeing fault in others, we look within ourselves, we are loving God. If instead of robbing others to help ourselves, we rob ourselves to help others, we are loving God. If we suffer in the sufferings of others and feel happy in the happiness of others, we are loving God. If instead of worrying over our own misfortunes, we think of ourselves as more fortunate than many, many others, we are loving God. If we endure our lot with patience and contentment, accepting it as His will, we are loving God. If we understand that the greatest act of devotion towards God is not to harm any of His beings, we are loving God. To love God as He ought to be loved, we must live for God and die for God, knowing that the goal of all life is to love God and find him as our own self. Therefore, let us become the soldiers of God. Let us struggle for the truth. Let us live not for ourselves, but for others. Let us speak truly, think truly, and act truly. Let us be honest as God is infinite honesty. Let us return love for hatred and win others over to God. Let the world know that above everything, the most dear to our hearts is God, the supreme reality. Besides keeping God before ourselves in our daily lives and loving him by loving our fellow men, we can love God by surrendering to the Sadguru, or perfect master, who is God's personal manifestation, or to the God-man, who is God descended directly into form. To surrender to any of these is to surrender to God himself. This is my song. For the rich, I am the richest. For the poor, I am the poorest. For the literate, I am the most literate. For the illiterate, I am the most illiterate. Thus I am one of you, one with you, and one in you. And we are all one. To have my real darshan is to find me. The way to find me is to find your abode in me. And the only one and sure way to find your abode in me is to love me. To love me as I love you, you must receive my grace. Only my grace can bestow the gift of divine love. To receive my grace, you must obey me wholeheartedly, with a firm foundation of unshakable faith in me. And you can only obey me spontaneously as I want when you completely surrender yourselves to me, so that my wish becomes your law and my love sustains your being. Age after age, many aspire for such a surrender, but only very few really attempt to surrender to me completely as I want. He who succeeds ultimately not only finds me and becomes me and realizes the aim of life. The final way to realize God is to love him and to lose oneself in him through intense longing for union with him. To love God wholeheartedly is to lose oneself eventually in the beloved and enter the eternal life of God. Like a tree, such love has branches, branches of wholehearted devotion, perfect selfless service, self-denial, self-sacrifice, self-renunciation, self-annihilation, and truth. In this love are embodied all the yogas known to saint and seeker. The highest aspect of this love, which surpasses love itself, is that of complete surrender to the will of the beloved. This means complete obedience to his wishes, regardless of the cost. The perfect masters are always immersed in the joy of this union with God and can never be snared in the mazes of the illusory universe. Therefore, they do not ordinarily pay any attention to the universe other than to divert the attention of humanity from the shadow to the substance. Divine love makes the individual true to himself and to others. It makes him live honestly, comprehending that God is infinite honesty. Divine love is the solution to all difficulties and problems. It frees man from all bindings. It makes him speak truly, think truly, and act truly. It makes him feel one with the whole universe. Divine love purifies the heart and glorifies one's being. When one truly loves God, that love is based on the desire to give up one's whole being to the beloved. When one loves a perfect master, one longs to serve him, to surrender to his will, to obey him wholeheartedly. Thus, pure, real love longs to give and does not ask for anything in return. When the individual truly loves humanity, she longs to give all for its happiness. When she truly loves her country, she longs to sacrifice life itself without seeking reward and without the least thought of having loved and served. When she truly loves her friends, she longs to help them without making them feel under the least obligation. When she truly loves her enemies, she longs to make them her friends. True love for parents or family makes her long to give them every comfort at the cost of her own. Trust God completely, and he will solve all difficulties. Faithfully leave everything to him, and he will see to everything. Love God sincerely, and he will reveal himself. And as you love, your heart must love so that even your mind is not aware of it. As you love God wholeheartedly and honestly, sacrificing everything at the altar of this supreme love, you will realize the beloved within you. Mahu, could you unmute and read on?
Yes. Chapter 9, Help to Others. On the path, the most important condition of discipleship is readiness to work for the spiritual cause of bringing humanity closer and closer to realization of God. Enough has been done to make people food-minded. Now they must be made God-minded. The downtrodden and the poor must understand that from the spiritual point of view, their misfortunes and miseries can be made into weapons in the struggle for the truth. They should be helped to see that these miseries can be counted as gifts from God, and if bravely and cheerfully faced, can become the gateway to eternal happiness. Because of its paramount importance in promoting the true well-being of humanity, spiritual work has a natural claim on all who love humanity. It is very necessary to be quite clear about its nature. The whole world is firmly established in the false idea of separateness and is therefore subject to all the complexities of duality. Spiritual workers have to help redeem the world from the throes of imagined duality by bringing home to it the truth of the unity of all life. To review briefly the problem of the redemption of mankind as it has been set forth in the preceding parts of this work, the root cause of the illusion of manyness lies in the soul's identification with its bodies or with the ego mind. Both the gross and the subtle bodies, as well as the ego mind of the mental body, are only media for experiencing the world of duality. They are not the media of knowing the true nature of the soul, which is above them all. By identification with the bodies or the ego mind, the soul gets trapped in the delusion of manyness. Actually, the soul in all bodies and ego minds is just one undivided existence, but as to be limited and looks upon itself as being only one among the many of creation. As a consequence, most souls are unconscious of their true nature.
Mahu, could you reread this paragraph? You missed a line.
Oh, I did. I'm sorry. Let me read it again. By identification with the bodies or the ego mind, the soul gets trapped in the delusion of manyness. Actually, the soul in all bodies and ego minds is just one undivided existence. But as it becomes confused with these bodies and ego minds, which are only vehicle, it considers itself to be limited and looks upon itself as being only one among the many of creation. As a consequence, most souls are unconscious of their true nature. Page 193. Their true nature as God, who is the oneness and the reality of all souls. Thus, God realization is present in them only in latent form, inasmuch as they have not yet experienced that oneness consciously. On the other hand, those very few who have cast off the veil of duality experience the soul itself without confusing it with any medium or vehicle. And in this experience, the soul consciously knows itself to be identical with God. In the realization of the truth of this oneness, life finds freedom from all limitation and suffering. For it is the self-affirmation of the infinite as infinity. In this state of spiritual perfection, the ego life has been finally and completely surrendered in the experiencing of divine truth. God is known and affirmed as the only reality. To realize God is to dwell in eternity. It is a timeless experience, but a spiritual work concerns itself with souls who are caught in the complexity of a creation which is knit by time. Therefore, spiritual workers cannot afford to ignore the element of time and the importance of its flow in creation. To ignore it would be to ignore the spiritual work itself. The task of the spiritual workers is to help in the universal dispensation of truth to a suffering humanity. They have both to prepare humanity to receive this truth and become established in it themselves. It is extremely important to remember that in helping others leave behind the illusion of duality and attain spiritual freedom, it is necessary to live and act constantly in the principle of the unity. The spiritual worker will be working for others who are inclined to create divisions where they do not exist and who will allow him no respite to recoup himself. The minds of people have to be purged completely of all forms of selfishness and narrowness if they are to inherit life in eternity. It is by no means an easy task to persuade people to give up these traits. It is not by accident that people are divided into the rich and the poor, the pampered and the neglected, the rulers and the ruled, the leaders and the masses, the oppressors and the oppressed, the high and the low, the winners of laurels and the recipients of ignominy. These differences are created and sustained by the spiritually ignorant, who are so attached to difference that they are not even conscious of its perversity, conscious of its perversity. They are accustomed to look upon life as divided into separate, watertight compartments and are unwilling to give up this separate attitude. I read this again. They are accustomed to look upon life as divided into separate, watertight compartments and are unwilling to give up this separative attitude. When the worker launches upon his spiritual work, he enters a field of divisions to which people cling desperately, which they accentuate and fortify, and which they strive consciously or unconsciously to perpetuate. More condemnation of these divisions will not enable the worker to destroy them. Divisions are nourished by separative thinking, and they yield only to the touch of life, touch of love and understanding. People must be won to the life of truth. They cannot be coerced into spirituality. It is not enough for the worker to have unimpaired friendliness and untarnished goodwill in his own heart. If he is to succeed in his work, he must give people the conviction that he is helping them to redeem themselves from bondage and suffering, and to realize the rightful heritage of the highest. There is no other way to help them attain spiritual freedom and enlightenment. To render spiritual help, one should understand clearly the following 4 points. 1, apparent descent to a lower level. It may often be necessary to descend apparently to the level of those whom one is trying to help. Though one's purpose is to raise people to a higher level of consciousness, they may fail to profit by what is said unless talk is in terms they understand. What is conveyed through thought, feeling should not go over their heads. They are bound to miss it unless it is adapted to their capacity and experience. However, while doing this, it is equally important not to lose one's own level of understanding. Approach and technique will be changed gradually as those being aided arrive at deeper and deeper understanding, and one's own apparent descent to the lower level will be only temporary. Number 2, spiritual understanding ensures well-rounded progress. Life must not be divided into departments, which are then dealt with separately and successively. Departmental thinking is often an obstacle to integral division. If one divides life into politics, education, morality, material advancement, science, art, religion, mysticism, and culture, and then thinks exclusively of only one of these aspects, the answers that are brought to life can be neither satisfactory nor final. If one succeeds, however, in awakening spiritual inspiration and understanding, then progress in all these departments of life is bound to follow automatically. Spiritual workers will have to aim at providing a complete and real solution to all the personal and social problems of life. Number 3, spiritual progress consists in the spontaneous growth of understanding from within. Spiritual workers also have to remember that the spiritual wisdom which they wish to convey to others is already present in latent form, and that it is only necessary to assist in unveiling that spiritual wisdom in them. Spiritual progress is not a process of accumulation from without. It is an unfoldment from within. A master is necessary for anyone to arrive at self-knowledge, but the true significance of the help given by the master rests in his ability to enable another to come into the full possession of his own latent possibilities. Number 4, some questions are more important than answers. Spiritual workers must not lose sight of the real work, which should be accomplished. When it is clearly understood that the spiritual wisdom is latent in all, the worker will no longer be anxious to provide others with ready-made answers. In many cases, we will be content to set up a new problem or to clarify the nature of a problem already faced. He may have done his duty if he asks someone a question in a practical situation which that person would not have asked himself. In some cases, the worker will have done his duty if he succeeds in putting another person in a searching attitude so that he begins to understand and attack his problems along some more fruitful line. The questions the worker may help to formulate should be neither theoretical nor unnecessarily complicated. If they are simple, direct, and fundamental, these questions will answer themselves and people will find their own solutions. Nevertheless, indispensable service will have been rendered for without tactful intervention. The individual would not have arrived at the solution of his various problems from a spiritual point of view. The spiritual worker necessarily is confronted by many obstacles, but obstacles are meant to be overcome. Even if some of them seem insuperable, he must help do his best to help others, irrespective of results or consequences. Obstacles, they're surmounting, success, failure, are all illusions within the infinite domain of unity. And the worker's task is already done when it is done wholeheartedly. I read this again. Obstacles, they're surmounting, success, failure are all illusions within the infinite domain of unity. And the worker's task is already done when it is done wholeheartedly. Work must be performed without worrying about consequence, regardless of success or failure. One may be sure that work done in this spirit and with this understanding yields inevitable results. Through the untiring activities of spiritual workers, humanity will be initiated into the new life of abiding peace and dynamic harmony, unconquerable faith and unfading bliss, immortal sweetness and incorruptible purity, creative love and infinite understanding.
Please continue, Mahu. I don't think Etzipin wants to read. Do you, Etzipin? Or would you like to read? How about you, Mona? Would you like to read?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
Awesome.
Avatarhood. Chapter 1. Personal Relationship. How can one being assess another who is entirely beyond his level? How can an ammeter measure a current beyond its capacity? How can a drop measure the ocean? These questions are inevitably raised as one reads parts 1 and 2 of the book. It has not seemed honest to pose them without at least giving recognition to them and some signposts suggesting their solution. I am of many persons who have asked these questions repeatedly of themselves. It has seemed both strange and important that the answers we have found have so often been the same. Therefore, this final section is framed from my own thoughts of, self-arguments and gradual conclusions concerning my personal relationship to Meher Baba.
Let's see what the asterisk refers to.
Yep. And independent viewpoint on this subject is given by Irene Conybeare in the closing portions of Civilization or Chaos, Chetana Bombay. Undoubtedly, this is a rash approach, but I know no other way to suggest the profound effect Meher Baba has on the life of another human being, of the questions he raises, of the support one receives from him in the solution of those problems, and of the conclusions one gradually draws from these experiences. I intend to avoid any attempt at a scholarly comparison of Baba's traits with those of Krishna, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and other personages historically less well defined. I am not a theologian nor a student of comparative religion. Further, I lived close to the lifetime of Meher Baba and the swirl of human events generated by his powerful personality to try to express any part of the opinion of posterity. My only honest basis of expression is as one human being who has lived initially in the intense subjective experience of deep questioning which Meher Baba so frequently generates. Later, I have lived in the air of calm, which seems equally to flow from him. Both the confusion as well as the clarities must be described because one forms the warp while the other forms the woof of the fabric of spirit which is woven. It is important to give full recognition to both because we in the Western world have inherited a confusing attitude towards this essential interplay. Religion, philosophy, and mysticism have come to mean a last possible antidote to the pains of life. When life becomes unbearably distressing, the contemplative arts are looked to for an alleviant. Therefore, it is assumed that they must not produce pain in themselves, and that those teachers who use them must provide only solace and healing. Why resort to them otherwise? However, this allows no real scope for the suggestions for the surgeon's skill. Often he must cleanse, cut, and cauterize. And if the patient withdraws at the first sign of pain, it is doubtful that the source of disease can always be reached and the trouble remedied. The East has learned perhaps more than we that there must be great effort and there may be great pain in man's coming to grips with himself. Yet many pursue the matter regardless of these deterrents. They recognize that the conscious head on attack is far more bearable in the long run than to allow the unconscious teacher nature to continue its painfully tedious tutelage. Thus, there is some tradition in the East that the best course is to come to grips with the great central problem and to accept the disciplines necessary to its solution. In the West, there is the unconscious opinion that help should consist in soothing ointment applied by the gentle touch of a healer. This notion is almost fatal to the progress of the intelligent, seeking Western mind. Hence, it is necessary to recognize the important role that conflict and confusion play in the human development and to construct gradually our own tradition of their acceptance. To develop such a tradition, it is necessary to accept, recognize, and preserve the facts of trial, difficulty, and pain in the lives of our own great seekers. When this has been done and accepted as positive instrument through which the divine grace often works, it will be of the greatest help in assisting the seeking individual to persist through the first difficult steps. I was entirely unprepared for the questions which were raised in full cry when I first heard Meher Baba discussed. My first feeling was that people were speaking in his name who seemed poorly equipped to do so. Surely, if he were indeed a great man, he must know about the activities and that they were not doing his cause much good. Logic led from this observation to the inevitable conclusion that Baba was probably either a fake or a fool. There seemed no easy way out. Further, undertaking silence and then using the subterfuge of an alphabet board for communication seemed childish. Next, there was the very troublesome fact that he seemed on occasion to interfere grossly in people's lives and finances, asking them to do things which disrupted the normal pattern of life. What if I should gradually become entangled with him and he should ask me to give up any present way of life? And then there was the equally troublesome question of what one's friends and one's business associates would think. Finally, there was the almost indigestible fact that he let himself be called the Christ of our times, even allowing the statement to get into print. True humility would seem to avoid such assertions, even if by some chance they were true. With a net strikeout record such as this, there seemed no possibility that Meher Baba could legitimately be a great spiritual teacher. And yet, one of my closest friends and spiritual guide of the some years standing was convinced that Meher Baba was the greatest spiritual teacher of our age. I could not shrug off this fact, and yet I could not accept the one who was at contest. For 5 years, Meher Baba was the central question mark in almost every day of my life. Out of loyalty to my friend, I could not reject Meher Baba even in the privacy of my own thoughts. Yet, equally, I could not honestly accept him because of the matters which weighed so heavily against him. I was forced to do something which I have never been able to duplicate. I constructed a watertight dam around all the black negation that wanted to flow out of me, and then camouflaged it so completely that I could walk casually by it several times a day. The feeling was entirely dammed off. But I did allow myself a dry intellectual recognition of the issues still unsolved. My first object lesson in the questions I had raised to come from my business life. I think no one is given any organizational responsibility without concluding very quickly that the job must be done with the material available. Further, if there is one human crime greater than that of making blunders, it is failing to try to help and support the people who are doing the blundering. There is certainly a time to prod people into better performance, but the horse carrying the load does not live on prods alone. Further, many mistakes can be forgiven if they have been made with honest intent. Within 2 years, these things had been made crystal clear. I began to suspect that perhaps Mayor Baba found himself in the position in which every other boss finds himself, of having to make the best possible use of the resources at hand. Once, having come to this conclusion, the rest of the answers began to come quickly. I met several people who had been with Mayor Baba, and it was readily apparent that generally they were of unusual caliber. My first point definitely had been off base. The question of observing silence was also soon paired into neutrality. An unusual series of drains on my energies left me completely knocked out for several months. And when I was at lowest ebb, I tried speaking just as little as possible. To my astonishment, I found that it was of marked help. From this point, it was an easy step to realize that a great spiritual teacher might easily wish to conserve energy for vital spiritual activities. My answer might be wrong, but at least I could see a ray of reason. I began to feel better. The dull feeling of heaviness at the pit of my stomach began to lighten, and I could feel that one day I would be able to exhume the whole matter and work it out. As I read more about Baba and talked with people who knew him, it began to be clear that while he sometimes asked people to do very difficult things, he did not do so unless they were ready as tricks. It is an interesting fact that Baba has asked only a very small number of persons in literal fact to give up all and follow him. This situation is more frequently the reverse, in which an individual begs to be allowed to give up his current life in the world of affairs to be with Baba, and Baba insists that he remain at his post. For the great mass of people, the call to give up all and follow me means give up all attachment to your present worldly life and follow my way. However, it is only truthful to point out that there is always the minute percentage who are apparently intended to take the command quite literally, but they are not the ones who are frightened by its conditions. This realization still provided scant comfort. It is difficult to be shivering in one's boots and yet try to imagine oneself completely able to cope with a problem which now produces only fear. The fear must be met over and over again and faced in so many ways that it becomes a familiar face. Then it begins to wither. As for friends, one and one's business associates, well, people of good caliber are surprisingly tolerant of another person's odd problems. Their caliber is usually built solidly on their recognition of their own profound needs. They stick by one. All in all, it is surprising how little a crisis is involved in accepting someone such as Meher Baba as one's guide and to allow that fact to become known. This left one final question: the Christhood of Meher Baba. Was he really the avatar of the age? If he was, how could I know it? I believe that I cannot know until the day I too finally have achieved the godhood within me, for only perfection can know perfection. Nevertheless, it is important that I work constantly at this question, and it is important that others work hard at it also. It cannot be sloughed off on the basis that it is a matter of no real concern for oneself. It is the most supremely important question which anyone can ask, because in it lies the ultimate question: why am I here? My original distress at Meher Baba's unusual way of working was typical of, although perhaps more acute than the difficulties many people have. But such upset is only the introduction to the man himself. Once the barrier of conventional prejudice has been broken down and the individual has established his own contact with Meher Baba, then the real work within the relationship begins. I have already described elsewhere my initial reactions to Meher Baba on first meeting him as Trix. See the introduction to God Speaks. His entirely unexpected impact on my internal functioning, which resulted within 2 days in virtual elimination of my strong tendency to worry, was only a clue to what was to come. During the next 4 years, 1952 to 1956, I was with Meher Baba first for 2 weeks in India and then for somewhat longer in America. This is not a large total, but it would be more accurate to say that I was with him all the time, for I constantly and powerfully, for I felt constantly and powerfully his guiding influence. This is a fragile point which I was to reinforce. I have never felt as if Meher Baba was looking down the size of the gun barrel of my life as I aimed at one point and then another. I am sure I would be annoyed by such supervision of my moves. It is as if he busies himself quietly with setting parts of one's nature into motion that had either stagnated or never been in motion, rescues other parts from whirlpools in which they had been caught, supplies energy and direction to get these things moving properly, and then calms overwrought nerves too long jangled by futile endeavor. Having done this, he makes no effort to jump into the driver's seat but allows the individual to use or abuse his overhauled in as he wills. It is only fair to point out that Will has meanwhile undergone some modification as well. One has the feeling of being able to listen intently and pick up a soft but distinct direction signal that has started. There is nothing compulsive about the signal, for I can and often have overruled it, but I trust it and I listen for it because I find that the results make me happy and a unified man. There is another important characteristic of this discretion.
Direction.
Sorry, yeah. There is another important characteristic of this direction signal. It works equally in the messy parts of life. As a developing human being, I have a number of very problematical sides to my nature. I just as soon they weren't there because they are a real drain. The truly astounding thing about one's relationship to Meher Baba is that nothing is rejected or suppressed. I can think of none of the awkward, discouraging, embarrassing sides of myself which I would not show to Meher Baba. However, the matter is even more intimate than this. One has the instinctive feeling that Baba already knows the worst which can be known about one, that he has accepted it, forgiven it, and gone about its constructive reclamation, not rejection in the flash of an eye. There are not idle words of praise. Here one finds not just compassion, but real forward motion. This knowledge provides a great feeling of hope and courage. It is truly astounding to have lived for weary years with certain basic problems, to see them under the best of circumstances move in hesitant, grudging starts, and then suddenly, under the unspectacular impact of a silent man from India, to find them all moving vigorously ahead. Much of the sickness at heart, discouragement, and bitterness in living comes from the gradual eroding away of a sense of hope. As a child or even in early adult life, the individual unconsciously accepts the best of life and of himself. Then it begins to be clear that neither he nor can he expect the best. This is usually known as coming to grips with reality. No doubt reality is a good thing, but it is unfortunate that in the soil of reality lie the seeds of the destruction of hope. Slowly, one seems to grind to a halt and to accept with resignation the barriers of habit, character, and circumstance. This is allness, true allness. One of the greatest gifts received from Baba is the renewal of spontaneity, for as he sets one nature incomprehensibly back into motion, life again becomes an adventure. There is newness, unpredictability, hope, sustainment around each corner in time. The soul becomes once more like a child, and one is struck by the likeness of one's heart. Life is no less complex. There are no fewer problems to be solved. One's consciousness of the tragedies of life has not become dulled, not been dulled. But the greatest tragedy of all, the loss of hope, has been wiped out. No wonder there is room for happiness. The deep loyalty, devotion, and trust which Meher Baba adherents give to him is based in part on this relief from stagnation which he provides. It is also based on another factor, a certainty of support in crisis, of all the intangibles in which Bear Baba deals. This is perhaps the most difficult to fathom. One day there is not the courage to face certain things in self and in the world. The next day the courage is there. Meher Baba has come into one's life in the interim. This is not a solitary observation based on one person's experience. It would be remarkable even if that were the case. It is the experience of thousands and thousands who have who have had personal contact with the silent man. It is
Uh,
possible. Yep.
Pardon me, Mona. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll continue here next week at the top of page 206.
Thank you, Eugene.
Always a pleasure.